I mean, this is basically a part of an ongoing project that there's a lot of, as you will see, especially towards the second half of this talk, there's a lot of open questions. And I will probably, this will be relatively short, and I hope there's plenty of time for discussion at the end. Biopolitics emerged as a principal concern in humanities scholarship over the past decade. Roughly over the past decade and a half. It's not difficult to see the reason for this surge of interest in the concept, which, when Foucault first introduced it in the history of sexuality and his lectures at the Collège de France during the second half of the 70s, actually had found rather little resonance. It was the so-called war on terror, waged in the wake of the terror attacks of 9/11, which furnished a set of historical circumstances in which sovereign power and its ability to invoke the state of exception was spectacularly on display. The extraterritorial internment camp at Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary conditions, the use of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, all of these events offered powerful illustrations of the biopolitical mechanisms of exclusion which Giorgio Agamben and Akil Mbembe described in their discussions of bare life and necropolitics, respectively. At the same time, the vast expansion of government surveillance programs in the name of homeland security, the introduction of new biometric controls to keep tabs on the movement of people and information, the development of new methods for the analysis of metadata. All of these were developments which appear to confirm Antonio Negri's analysis of empire, that is to say, of the global neoliberal order, which deploys biopower in order to wrest surplus value from life. Without a doubt, this work had very important things to say about its own historical moment, and all of the developments that it talked about remain as relevant today as they were a decade ago. However, I think it's probably safe to say that other concerns have come to the fore in recent years, which require a shift in perspective. By that, I mean, of course, the increased concern about the cumulative impact of world society on the biosphere, and about the biosphere's continued ability to support a growing human population. Against this background, it is worth taking another look at Foucault's work, keeping in mind that the post-9/11 wave of biopolitical theorizing missed and even misrepresented several important aspects of Foucault's argument. I think that Leroy Medovoy is absolutely right when he writes that the rapid embrace of Agamben and Mbembe and Mbembe's writings on biopolitics constituted a willful forgetting of both the original motivations and the insights associated with Michel Foucault's thesis about the rise of human biopower. End of quote. Much of the same, I think, can probably be said about Negri's theory of empire. After all, the point of departure for Foucault's argument about biopolitics, was the observation that the politics of sovereignty fell into crisis in the 18th century because it found itself unable to effectively govern a society which was undergoing rapid population growth and economic expansion. That's how he describes it in the lectures in the Collège de France, in the Society Must Be Defended and the Birth of Biopolitics. It was in reaction to this crisis that the politics of sovereignty, he argued, was gradually supplemented and displaced by a new modality of government, which no longer conceived of the governed primarily as juridical subjects, but rather addressed them as living bodies, both individually, by what Foucault had earlier already described in terms of disciplines or anatomal politics, and at the level of entire populations, which now became knowable through new methods of statistical aggregation, constituting the field of biopolitics proper. Agamben, in particular, cast biopolitics basically as a more radical and more totalizing version of the old politics of sovereignty. And I think this is very, very different from what Foucault argues. For Foucault, biopolitics is something much more expansive and also qualitatively different. In the 1976 lecture, Society Must Be Defended, which were published by the title Society Must Be Defended, he goes as far as asserting that, quote, the new mechanisms of power were absolutely incompatible with relations of sovereignty. Biopolitics for Foucault is not a prerogative of the state, but is exercised by a host of sub-state actors, which constitute what liberal thought would refer to as civil society. It is exercised, for example, by, quote, medical institutions, welfare funds, insurance, and so on. By reform movements and by what nowadays we would call NGOs. While biopolitics may be totalizing in the sense that it seeks to intervene in and regularize life in a much more pervasive and fine-grained fashion than could have been imagined under the modality of sovereign power, it does not, in the words of Paul Rabineau and Nicholas Rose, quote, emerge from or serve to support a single power block, dominant group, or set of interests. It is finally something that is much more fundamentally ambivalent, I think, than most recent theorists of biopolitics have allowed for. It is not something that we could simply condemn and reject. Now, in order to illustrate these points, and to show how they link up, in my view, to the question of ecology and to the idea of a biopolitics of the non-human, allow me to quote a rather long passage from the history of sexuality. A passage which immediately precedes the passage where he talks about the advent of biopolitics as the threshold to modernity. From Victor Symposium, of course. Foucault's aim in this passage is to establish the genuine historical novelty of biopower, despite the obvious fact that politics, of course, has always been, in some sense, concerned with governing living beings. And now, allow me to read this. For me, it's one of the key passages. The pressure exerted by the biological on the historical had remained very strong for thousands of years. Epidemics and famine were the two great forms of this relationship that was always dominated by the menace of death. The economic development of the 18th century, I've already shortened this quite a bit with ellipses, but the economic development of the 18th century and an increase in productivity and resources, even more rapid than the demographic growth it encouraged, allowed a measure of relief from these profound threats. The development of the different fields of knowledge concerned with life in general, the improvement of agricultural techniques, and the observations and measures relative to man's life and survival contributed to this relaxation. Western man was gradually learning what it meant to be a living species in a living world, to have a body, conditions of existence, probabilities of life, an individual and collective welfare, forces that could be modified, and a space in which they could be distributed in an optimal manner. For the first time in history, biological existence was reflected in political existence. The fact of living was no longer an inaccessible substrate that only emerged from time to time, amid the randomness of death and its fatality. Part of it passed into knowledge field of control and power sphere of intervention. Power would no longer be dealing simply with legal subjects, although the ultimate dominion was death, but with living beings. Okay, leave it there. There are a couple of points here that I would like to emphasize. First of all, Foucault casts biopower as a form of knowledge power that is concerned first and foremost with what can be designated as the ecological conditions of human existence. The emergence of biopower signals an epochal break insofar as it reconfigures the relationship between the process of history and the movements of life. This argument, I would say, actually anticipates recent debates about the Anthropocene, and especially about climate change, which as Dipesh Chakrabarty has famously argued, collapses the distinction between natural history and human history. Foucault does not suggest that these two domains were ever entirely separate, of course, but before the advent of biopolitics, that is, before the threshold to modernity is crossed, their relationship was essentially a negative one. Ecological constraints manifested themselves in the form of disease and famine, that is, in the form of catastrophic events that were perceived to be outside of human control, acts of God, as it were, testifying to the power of a divine sovereign that was no more accountable to human beings than the king was to the peasant. Now, I'm not a specialist on Foucault at all, actually, but I cannot help but suspect that when he was writing these things, Foucault was taking a page from the Annals of History, and specifically from the historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who in the Histoire des climats depuis l'an 1000, which was translated as Times of Feast and Times of Famine, a history of climate after 1000. This book had been published in 1967, and actually also another book, The Peasants of Languedoc, where he looked, which was published just a year earlier. And I mean, this book is now recognized as an early milestone for environmental history. It was one of the earliest efforts to understand the long-term effects of climatic variability in society. And what Ladurie had shown was that the population of France, from the middle, I mean, not by himself, of course, there were other demographic historians, but I think that was his work around that time was very much focused on this question, that the population of France from the Middle Ages into the modern period had been in a tight grip of Malthusian cycles. During the 14th century, largely as a result of the Black Death, the population had crashed from 20 million to a little more than 10 million. By the early 16th century, it had rebounded, but between 1560 and 1720, it oscillated between 18 and 20 million, with brief spurts of population growth offset by frequent famines and epidemics. It's important to understand what this meant for the people actually living during this time. That's what Ladurie writes about that in The Peasant of Languedoc. It meant that the average peasant couple would have maybe 6 or 7 children over their lifetime, but nevertheless population didn't grow. A cool and wet summer, and of which there were plenty, because this was, of course, what we now call the Ice Age, would reduce the harvest, lead to malnutrition, which in turn would leave people more vulnerable to disease. And if it was followed by a cold winter, you would have a population drop of 2 or 3%, which happened several times during this period. So mortality rates would skyrocket. And it was only in the 18th century that population began to enter a steady period of growth, reaching about 30 million by the end of the 18th century. And that is the historical demographic setting in which Foucault says biopolitics emerged and begins to displace sovereign power. What this suggests is that the epochal significance of the emergence of biopower is not nearly exhausted by the fact that it leads to new forms for governing people, which of course it does, it's very important. But even though this is, of course it's also the aspect that Foucault mostly focused on. But more fundamentally, I think, its significance consists in the development of methods which allow human society to insulate itself from the vagaries of the ecological environment to an unprecedented degree. So, so biopower, we might say, is concerned with the manipulation of the relationships between different biological species, the relationships between biological species and their biophysical environments, about the control of trophic cascades, parasitism and predation, with the ultimate aim of protecting the human population against the adverse effects of fluctuations in the ecological environment. In his research, Foucault was, of course, more interested in medicine, but as the above passage should make clear, the development of modern agriculture would have to account as every bit as important. And we could say that biopolitics is centrally concerned with non-human life because managing human populations necessarily entails the management of non-human populations. I mean, it entails managing populations of microbes, mosquitoes, rice, wheat, mice, pigs, ducks, and so forth. Kerry Wolf is among the few scholars, I think, who have recognized the full weight of this when he argues that the modern factory farm should be considered as a paradigmatic instance of the biopolitical imperative to make live. Nowhere else is the full panoply of methods for intervening in the life process, and I quote Wolf, eugenics, artificial insemination and selective breeding, pharmaceutical enhancement, inoculation, and the like. Nowhere else is it as fully as on display as in the modern factory. So one way of summarizing this, and from now on I'm going to have to wing it a little bit and just go by my PowerPoint. One way of summarizing that would be to say that the principal aim of biopolitics is to confer what I would call ecological immunity. Immunity in the complex and deeply ambivalent sense elaborated by Bergthaller. Of course, Roberto Esposito, of course, many of you are probably familiar with this, argues that we should read the term immunity as the antonym of community, with both derived from the same Latin root, mundus, which meant something like communal duty, a debt, a burden, and an obligation that arises from mutual gift-giving. So community, cum mundus, means to be under obligation, and that's something that Esposito emphasizes, and I think that's very useful when looking at the notion of ecological community, which of course is very popular in eco-criticism too, and environmentalist thought. And environmentalist thinking very often argues that we have to realize we're part of the ecological community, and we have to recognize our kinship with other species, and that is the solution to all of our troubles. And I think if you keep in mind this, what Esposito calls the expropriative dimension of community, I think that's very helpful to kind of see the limitations of that way of talking about ecological community. Because of course, the ecological community, when used by ecologists, originally all this meant was really you're part of the food bank. To be part of the ecological community means you're food for somebody else. You eat others and you're food. You can be subject to predation, you will suffer from diseases and so forth. And in a sense, you might say a level of ecological immunity is what is necessary for any organism to survive. I mean, ecological immunity is, you might say, the distance that the organism keeps from its environment in order to, as long as it is alive. That it needs to keep, in order to be alive, and that it keeps as long as it is alive. Now, of course, Esposito emphasizes the juridical dimension of immunity. He mostly, I think, reconstructs the tradition of political liberalism as a history of successive immunizations. That in a sense, the modern individual that has certain rights that can be protected from the state, that is kind of the ultimate outcome of this process of immunization. And I think that what we maybe should want to try, if you're interested in the biopolitics of the non-human, would have to be to correlate this history of immunizations, as Esposito describes it, with a history of ecological immunizations, of ways in which we have collectively managed to immunize ourselves against against the ecological environment. So I think it's sort of coming from Esposito then, really the point there is to emphasize the deeply ambivalent status of both ecological community and ecological immunity. You might say that the situation in which we find ourselves today is one where we realize that, as Esposito, of course, keeps saying, that immunity is always at the risk of turning into autoimmunity, so that the immune protections end up destroying that which they're supposed to protect. In a sense, what we see nowadays, I think in many ways, is precisely that in terms of many of our ecological problems today, I think, can be described in these terms. You might say that the successful protection against famine and disease produces dangers of its own. For example, exponential growth of population and resource consumption. It also leads to a loss of autonomy in the sense, and this is really something that I think links up to the talks about Malthusianism that we had yesterday. Loss of autonomy that would sound like a contradiction at first, because isn't immunizing ourselves against fluctuations in the environment doesn't mean that we become more autonomous from the ecological environment. But of course, ecological immunization is always organized collectively, and that means that individuals become very dependent on that. We all are dependent on, medical systems, we depend on a collectively organized food supply. So in a sense, as this process advances, the individual actually feels it, or you might say there's an individual experience of a loss of autonomy. And so I think in a sense, maybe there is a kind of tension between ecological immunization and the sort of immunization as a process of individualization, as Esposito describes it, I think. If I say these two histories need to be correlated, there's a tension between the two. They don't actually kind of proceed in tandem, as it were. And again, ambivalence of ecological community, I think I've already tried I've already said what I think this implies for me. Community needs to be part of the food chain, basically. And again, this is something that environmentalists thinking very often unduly sentimentalizes. What this leaves us with then is what Esposito himself describes as a kind of immunitary double bind. In a sense, you're doomed if you do, you're doomed if you don't. Existing defense mechanisms can no longer be dismantled without causing significant harm to life, but failure to dismantle them increases the risk of incurring even greater harm, you might say. But in a sense, you always have to kind of find temporary solutions to this basic contradiction, I would say. Maybe just sort of to very quickly pick up on this point about the tension between ecological immunity and immunity as protection of the individual against the state. Yesterday, Alex made the point that Malthusianism is kind of correlated with liberalism, or it's kind of an ideological armature of liberalism. And that's something that I think I would disagree with that on the basis of what I've just said, because in a sense, I think almost the opposite is the case. That Malthusianism it requires. I'm getting tangled up in my ideas here. Of course, like historically, Malthusianism has been employed by. Actually, all these measures that are very often proposed to control population, they are so suspect because they run so fundamentally counter to liberal ideas about individual rights. They're actually deeply, the reason why there's so much resistance to them has a lot to do because, China is always held up as the reason why this is a toxic idea. Because, the state telling you can only have one child that is a fundamental violation of the kinds of protections of individual rights that liberalism is all about, right? So I would say that in a sense that would be exactly one of those moments when, when there is a tension between what I would call ecological humanization and the sort of humanization that is supposed to describe. But this is of course, as you will have noticed, where it gets very tentative. So I'll shut up and hope that you have questions that maybe allow me to kind of articulate some of the ideas in some of this discussion.